Hi, this is Bob from INSYDIUM, and in this official training video we'll be recreating this dynamic domino effect. We'll be using xpBullet rigid bodies and setting up this xParticles procedurally generated rig. So let's get started. So here we are in a fresh scene, and let's build up this domino shot. So what we're going to need first is a floor object, and we'll make that with a cube. So let's just get a cube primitive, and we'll set the dimensions. Let's make it pretty big. We'll make the X 2000, we'll make the Y just 10, and we'll make the Z 2002. So we have a square surface, and that's looking pretty good. So what we want, we actually want the surface of this just to be at the default world origin on, 0 on the Y. And because we have 10 centimeters depth, that means we need to nudge it down by 5 centimeters to make this surface be at 0 on the Y. So let's just go to our cube coordinates, and we'll just put -5 on the Y, and there we go. And now that is orientated and positioned where we want it. So we want this cube, it's going to be our floor. Let's call it floor. Let's get organized right from the get-go. There we go. And we will give it a xpBullet collider tag. So let's go to tags, INSYDIUM, bullet tags, and we'll pick a bullet collider, and we'll just leave it at default. So now this is, it'll be dynamic, and our bullet rigid bodies will be able to interact with it. Good. So now we're going to set up a load of xParticles objects to create our domino rig. So let's go to INSYDIUM, xParticles, and bring in a system. And the default emitter that comes into the scene is firing out these particles on the +Z. So let's just make a couple of changes to that. We'll go to the object tab of that emitter, and we will change the emitter shape from rectangle to circle. We will change the emitter plane from +Z to +Y, so that means they're going to be firing upwards now. We're going to give them a cone angle. Let's just activate the 3D view here, which will just help you visualize what cone angle does. So at the moment, you can see that, look, the 3D view is going directly upwards, which is exactly the path in which our particles are taking. If we increase the cone angle, you can see, look, now those particles will be taking this path. So what we're going to do is set that to the full 90 degrees. Just let's switch that 3D view off. Okay, so now we're getting this effect, which isn't exactly what we want, because all our dominoes we want to go across the floor. But we're going to be using some other objects to ensure that happens in a moment. Before we do, what we're going to do, the way our rig is going to work, is that we're going to control some emitter particles, which are going to effectively trace the path that our dominoes are going to take. So these particles, let's rename this and call it xpEmitter. We're going to call these arrow particles. There's not going to be that many, and they don't want to be emitting continuously. So let's go to our emission tab, and we will change it from rate to shot, and we will change the amount. Let's just do 1. Let's do 1 particle. There we go. If we hit play, now we've just got 1 particle. Let's change the display of this particle to an arrow. So we'll go to our display tab. We'll go to the editor display and change it from squares to arrow. And there we can see the arrow. Now, something's wrong here. Look. We have our arrow. Let's just increase that. Let's put it up to, say, 30 centimeters radius. So we've got a nice big arrow, but it's not pointing in the direction it's traveling. So we need to activate some rotation, which will get it to point in the way it's going. So to do that, let's go to the extended data tab. We will go to the general data. We want to use rotation. And the type of rotation we want to use is tangential. And now if we hit play, you'll see that that arrow will always be pointing in the direction that it is traveling. All right. Let's just give ourselves a few more frames in the viewport as well. We'll put this up to, say, 200. Excellent. So let's just get this arrow particle So it is only going on the kind of the X and the Z axis, and it's not going upwards. So to do that, we can go to our modifiers, and we could go to a motion modifier, and we can limit its motion. So let's pick that. We're looking for XP limit. There it is. And let's just take the axis that we want to limit is the Y. So these boxes are the X axis, the Z axis, and the Y axis. So let's just limit the Y axis by 100% so it can't move on the Y axis. So now if we hit play, it's taking that birth speed, but all of these particles are going to be going in this direction. So they're allowed to go along the Z and the X axes, but they're not allowed to go up and down, basically. So if we go to our emitter arrow, let's go to the emission tab, and let's just emit some more just so we get an idea of that. Let's emit 10. And now you can see, look, we've got all these particles spitting out, and they're not able to travel in the Y direction. And the reason we've set that up like this with a limit is because there's some more modifiers and dynamic objects that we'll be using a little later that will also be trying to push and pull those particles up and down. And as I say, we obviously want to limit that because our dominoes, we want to just go across this flat floor. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Let's just go to our emitter. We'll put that back down just to a shot of 1. So what we are going to do now is this. We have got our arrow, and we can manipulate this arrow with lots of different modifiers. So maybe we could just set some of that up very quickly. So let's give it some movement. Whilst we're setting it up, so we can visualize the kind of the path that it's tracing, let's get it to trace a trail where it has gone, and this will help us visualize exactly the path of this particle. So let's go to generators, and we will pick a XP trail, and the trail wants an emitter. So let's drag in our emitter arrow. Now when we hit play, now we're seeing its path. Now, obviously, it's not doing anything. It's just going in one direction. But we are going to be able to see how it moves when we set up that movement. So first of all, what should we use to move this particle around? Well, let's try a flow field dynamic object. So we'll go to our dynamics menu, and we want to pick a dynamic object. So let's go into this menu, and we're going to pick an XP flow field. Now this enables us to make a customized force field effectively. And let's just increase the bounds so it takes in our entire floor object. And you can see here that we've got these representations. And what these lines mean, these are the velocity vectors or the directional vectors of this force field. And the reason they're looking kind of very random is if we go to our flow field, to the layer, by default, there is a random layer in there. So this is going to, and we're viewing a slice of that random layer, but it is within this entire bounded box. So if we just go to display, at the moment we're just viewing the XY plane because it's less processor intensive. But if we change this to voxels, you'll see that we have this force field within the entire bounded box that we have brought in. So let's just put that back to XY plane. And if we change the type from these trails to, say, arrows, you'll see here, and that's the information that's going to be forcing our particle. As it makes its way through all of these arrows, it'll be changing its direction. So let's just, we'll switch those off for now, those vectors, because we don't really need to see them. But if we hit play, you're going to see that this is going to have an impact on the movement of our arrow particle. And there you can see it's moving around. But because we have that XP limit, it's not able to move up and down. So this is how we're going to get our nice windy, wiggly path of our dominoes. That's looking good. Okay, and if we go back to our emitter arrow, let's go to the emission. Let's put the shot up to say 15 particles. And you'll see that we're getting all of these nice weaving interlocking lines. Okay, so they're going a little bit too mad, really. Obviously, we want our domino lines. It's going to look pretty cool if they intersect a little bit, but we don't want them turning so furiously. So let's go to our XP flow field. We'll go to the Object tab. So we have our random layer, and then we've got some options below that. Now, we are affecting the direction of those particles. So the flow field isn't giving them any speed information, just direction. And if we reduce this strength, it's not going to have as much of an effect over that directional force. So if we hit play now, you'll see they're not wiggling and moving around quite as forcibly. So 2% looks pretty good. We can even maybe put it up to 3. And then once we've got that, we can cycle through different seeds to get different random vectors. So if we click this once, we'll get a different random shape, and they'll move slightly differently. So let's just leave it at that for now. All right. So one thing we've now just got our particles, and all of the movement is happening from this random layer that we've got in our flow field. But what we could do is we could give them a little bit of uniformity to help it look a little bit more ordered and less random, but we're still going to get a bit of the wiggling from the flow field. And we're going to get that from this uniformity from another modifier. So let's go to our modifiers menu, and we want to choose another motion modifier. And what we're going to do is we're going to pick a rotator. So let's get this XP rotator. And let's just change the type from velocity to force. And we will leave it at default, and let's just see the result. Now, what this is going to happen is, if we just dolly in, you can see that this circular object has come into our scene. And if I this is our rotator. If I lift that up, you can see that there is an arrow and this circle. And if I hit play, you'll see it's rotating. So this is kind of rotating on the wrong plane here. What we want to do is we want to hit R for the rotation tool, and we want to rotate it so that arrow is pointing upwards. So now we're going to be getting a rotation in this direction on this plane. So let's just bring that down. We can make that invisible. And now, so we've got this rotating motion with our domino. So you can see we're getting this nice kind of spiraling, but our flow field is still giving us a little bit of wiggly movement here. So we could then go back to the flow field. Now that we've got our rotator in check, we can maybe increase the strength of this slightly. And then let's just change a couple of seeds. What I don't really want is too much bunching. And we're getting quite a lot of bunching here, which means we're going to have lots of dominoes knocking each other over. So we could cycle through seeds until we get one where that isn't happening as obviously, but we could also slightly alter the emission of these particles. So let's have a go at that. What we could do is go to our emitter, we go to the emission tab. Instead of shooting these all out on one frame, let's shoot them out over a period of, I don't know, say 4 frames. And we need to obviously reduce the amount of particles because we're shooting 15 per frame now, but we're shooting for 4 frames. So let's put this down just to say 4. All right. And also what we could do to ensure that we're not getting too much of an intersection, let's increase our disk radius up to, say, 70. And then what we'll do in our emitter, let's go to our advanced tab, and we're able just to cycle through some different seeds here, which will give us some different emissions. Let's put that way down. Okay, so that's looking pretty cool, and we can make further adjustments should we need. Right, so we have our particles with our trails, and this is visually showing us where our lines of dominoes are going to go. So what we could do now is actually start setting up, creating those dominoes. So let's just switch our trail off, And let's set up this system that is actually going to get us our dominoes actually generating, which will be real geometry, which we can then make dynamic and make into a proper fully dynamic interactive rig. So what we're going to do is we're going to spawn some particles from behind our arrows, which will become our dominoes. So let's just make this a little easier on ourselves. Let's put our shot count back down to 1, and let's put the duration just 1 frame. So now we're just dealing with 1 arrow particle. And there it is. So we're going to set up a spawn. So let's go to our modifiers, and we want to go to our generate modifiers because we want to generate something. So let's go in there and we'll pick an XP spawn. Now our XP spawn is going to ask for a spawning emitter. So we need a new emitter. So we can actually create one just by clicking on this add emitter button. So if we click on there, you will see that in the spawn, XP emitter has been put into that link window, and we have a new emitter in our object manager. And you can see the icon is slightly different. And this icon, if we go into that emitter, into the emission tab, you can see it's controlled only. So we can't adjust how many particles are going to be spat out here. It's a controlled emitter, and that's what this icon means. And it's being controlled by this spawn modifier. So let's go back to our spawn modifier. Let's have a look. So by default, it's going to spawn the new particles at the position of the source particle. So that's kind of what we want. When we've got these offsets, we've got a direction it's going to be traveling, we've got the speed, and we've got the spawn number. Now we've got a huge amount here. Look, a 300 per second. So let's hit play. And now we've got 300 particles per second being born at that point where our arrow is. So that's not what we want. But you can see them being affected by our flow field. And even that looks pretty cool. But it's not what we want. So we want to go to 1 particle per frame. And now if we do 1 particle per frame, hit play, it's still not looking right. Why not? Well, there's a couple of things going on here. With spawned particle speed set to absolute, that means it's taking its speed from the emitter itself. So let's just change that and call it emitter spawn so we know what it is. And let's go into its emission tab. So when it's in controlled only mode, we're not able to set when it emits and how many particles, but you are able to set the particle data. So its speed, its radius, for example, and it has a speed of 150, but we want these to be static. These are going to be our dominoes. So let's take that speed off. Okay, hit play, and they're still not static. So why aren't they static? Well, these new particles are being affected by our rotator, by our flow field, and if they were going up and down, also by our XP limit. So what we need to do is we need to go into that emitter and say, don't be affected by all of these objects. So the way in which we do that is we go to our emitter spawn, we're going to go to the modifiers tab, and look, by default, when an emitter is set up as a spawning emitter, it automatically has the XP spawn modifier discounted from the calculation. Otherwise, all of these spawn particles would spawn particles, and you get trapped in a circle, and before you know it, you'd have billions of particles. So all we need to do is drag the other modifiers that we don't want to affect the particles into this list. So let's go and we can just lock that. And let's drag in our flow field. We don't want that to affect our dominoes. We don't want the rotator to affect our dominoes. And we don't want the XP limit to affect our dominoes. Let's unlock that. So now when we hit play, now we have got our particles being born and creating this line. Okay, So one problem you may see is that these particles are possibly going to be a little bit too close together for our evenly spaced dominoes, but we'll address that a little bit later. So there are our dominoes, and the cool thing about all this is that it's all procedural. So when we get to the point of wanting to create more of these arrow particles for more streams of dominoes, all we do is go to the emitter, emission tab, let's put 15 particles, and now we've got 15 arrow particles, all spawning them using all of the same modifiers. Okay, let's put that back down to 1. So now let's create our geometry that is going to be our dominoes. So the way we'll do that is, let's just get a cube primitive. And this cube primitive, let's just bring it up a bit. And we're just going to kind of estimate a domino style shape here. You may have your own domino geometry that you want to use, which of course is fine, but I'm just going to do something a little bit like that maybe. Okay, that's going to be my domino. So I'm going to rename that and call it domino. Excellent. Now at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make this primitive cube editable. And that's because I want to move this axis origin from the center of the object right down to the bottom of it. So the axis is going to be at the floor. And that's important when it comes to generating our geometry. So let's hit C with the domino highlighted, and that turns it into a polygon object. And now we've done that with the domino highlighted, if we go to Mesh, Axis, let's go to the Axis Center, which brings up this. And what we're able to do is we're able to move, at the moment, the Axis Center is at 0% on the X, Y, and Z. So right in the middle of all of the axes. But what we want to do is we want this to be right at the bottom of the Y. So let's put it down to -100. And that means it's going to move it on the Y to 100%, which is right at the end down here. So press execute. And there we go, it's moved the axis of that object. So now, for example, if we hit rotate, it's going to rotate it from that point, not the middle. Excellent. Okay, so this is going to be our domino. So how do we get a domino for every one of our spawned particles? Well, we're going to use an XP generator. So let's go to the generators menu, and we'll go to the object tab. And then we've got our generator menu here from which we can pick. And we're going to pick the XP generator. There it is. Now the XP generator is going to ask, which emitter do you want to make stuff from? Well, do we want to make dominoes from the arrow or from the spawn? Well, it's a spawning emitter. That's where we want our dominoes. So let's drag in the emitter spawn here. And now what we need to do is make the object that we want to generate a child of the XP generator. So let's drag our domino down there. And we will change the clone type from duplicate to instance. And let's just hit play on default and see what we get. Hit play. So something's happened. If we just hit NA, so we're not seeing the lines, we have got loads of tiny little dominoes. But there's a couple of things that aren't right here. So first of all, they're far too small. And let's see how we adjust how big these dominoes are going to be. Well, if we go to the generator, you can see that there's a scale, rotation, and offset tab that controls that. So let's click on that. And we can see it's getting the scale from the particle radius. So all we need to do is go to our emitter spawn, go to our emission tab, and set the radius to be whatever radius we want. Let's just try this on, say, 30. Hit play. There we go. So we're starting to get a line of dominoes, but look, they aren't following the correct orientation. They haven't got that tangential orientation that our arrow has got. They're not pointing in the direction of travel. So how do we get that? Well, we need to go to our XP spawn, let's go to the Inherit tab, and let's make sure that we have got rotation checked, and then hit play. And we still haven't got the correct orientation, so why not? We have said that we want our dominoes to get the rotation from its parent particle, which is the arrow, and the arrow's orientated correctly. So why isn't it happening? Well, it's because if we go to our emitter spawn, if we go to the extended data, you'll see that we haven't got use rotation selected, which means they can't rotate into the correct place. They can't inherit that rotation. So let's just click that on, hit play, and now we're getting the proper orientation of our dominoes. Excellent. So we're getting closer to what we want here. We're getting a line of dominoes following wherever that arrow goes. And now if we go back to our emitter arrow, and let's go to the emission tab, let's increase that count again to say 15. Now we're getting all of these lines of dominoes being created, and it's kind of working. Excellent. Let's just put that back down to 1 while we make our adjustments. So now what we need to do, there's a few things we need to do. We need to ensure that we have got good spacing between our dominoes, because at the moment, look, some of them are just far too close to each other. So that's what we need to do. But remember, from the beauty render, we also need these to scale up as they are being born, which makes the scene look and feel much more dynamic. So let's explore how we're going to do that. So what we'll do, let's just, to make our viewport a little bit more tidy, let's go to our emitter spawn. You can see our emitter spawn is this red square, and that's showing us that it's a controlled emitter, but we don't really need to see that in the viewport. So let's go to our emitter spawn. We'll go to our display tab, and we will just deselect draw emitter. So that's not being drawn, and we'll do the same for our emitter arrow, so we don't see that circle. All right. Now we have a bit of a cleaner viewport, so let's hit play. So we want to sort out this spacing. So let's just switch off our generator for now so we can see our spawned particles. And our domino, which is being referenced, when we switch off the generator, obviously we see it again. So let's just get that domino, and let's just stick it up really high on the Y, just so it's out of the way. Okay. So how do we get our spaced particles here? Let's go to our spawn modifier. Now, if we go to the object tab and to the general tab, we said that we want to spawn 1 particle per frame, which is fine. We can either do per frame or per second. But per frame is too many. The dominoes are too close together. And per second, obviously, is not going to be enough. We've got, you know, these particles, one there, one there, one there. So that's obviously spaced way too much. So how do we do it? Well, we can use these intervals between spawns. So let's just say we want the max interval to be 2 frames and the min interval, it needs to be the same. We want it to be the same every time. So now there's going to be an interval between the spawning, and there we go. So we managed to space these out much better. So that's going to work for us as is. So now if we activate our generator, we've got much better spacing. So that was pretty painless. Excellent. So that's much better. Okay. Also, we don't really want to spawn on as soon as the arrow particle is born. So what we could do, just to ensure that, is let's just go forward 2 frames, and let's keyframe enabled. Let's go back a frame, switch that off. So all we've done is we've switched off that spawn modifier, so it's not going to be active until frame 2. And there we go. Perfect. Now we've got our nicely spaced particles. So now we want our particles to, we want them to scale up. We don't want them to start at this size. So to do that, we're going to use another modifier. Let's go to modifiers, and we'll go to control modifiers because we want to control the size of those. And let's go to XP scale. And this is how we're going to do it. So what we can do is we want to change the particle radius. That's fine, but we don't want to change that value over time. If we have it set to that, you'll see that they'll behave a bit oddly. They are being born and then they're suddenly shrinking down to an amount. So what's going on here? Well, what's happening is the particle, when it is born, is set to be, let's go to our emitter spawn, it'll tell us, we have set it to be 30 centimeters. But then our XP scale modifier is kicking in and it's saying, change the value over time, and it's changing it by 0.2 centimeters every second, so it should grow. But because by default we have clamp to radius limit active, and that limit is 20 centimeters, it's just immediately been clamped to 20 centimeters. So it's been born at 30, which is what we set in the spawning emitter, and then it's immediately been clamped back down to 20. So if we put this to say 60, what you're going to see is it's going to be born and then it's going to gradually grow and grow and grow and grow until it gets to 60 centimeters. But obviously that's not what we want. What we want to do is not change value over time, but we are going to set that value. Let's click on that and we're going to set the value to 30. So now nothing is going to look different. The particles are born at 30 centimeters and then the scale modifier is setting them to be that 30 centimeters. So how are we going to get them to grow up? Well, we are going to go to mapping and we're going to use some data mapping. So let's add a map. And first we need to say, what's the parameter that we want to map? Well, we need to find the radius value. So let's click that. And this radius value is, in the object tab, this radius value that we've put here, 30 centimeters. Go back to mapping, radius value. And we're setting it, by default it's set to age, so we could probably leave that. Let's just put it on, say, 20 frames. So what this is saying is, when the particle is 0 frames old, it has 0% of the radius value. So that's nothing. It'll have no size at all. And then when it is 20 frames old, which is this knot, it has 100% of the radius value, which is 30. So let's have a look. It should start small and grow up. So that's working, but we're getting this weird flash. Why are we getting that weird flash? Well, that's because the particles are being born from the spawning emitter at 30 centimeters, but then the scale modifier is immediately taking over and making them 0, and then they're growing back up. So to get rid of that flash, all we need to do is make sure they're born at 0 centimeters. So let's go to our emitter spawn. Let's put our radius down to 0. And now, there we go. We're getting our dominoes growing up. Now, I would think, arguably, we can obviously adjust this later, but we could set that to, say, 30 frames, and then they'll grow over that time. Excellent. So that's looking really nice. And again, let's go to our emitter arrow and let's put that on, say, 10, hit play. And now we have this stream of dominoes all being born and working their way up. So that's looking really nice. We're getting very close to the look that we want. So we're going to now explore how we make all this dynamic. But before we do, let's just make a couple of alterations to the viewport so this looks a little bit visually more pleasing whilst we're working on it. And we can do that just by setting up a couple of viewport lights. So let's just fold up our XP system and we will do a couple of things. Let's go to our Cinema 4D light object. There we are, we've got one there. We'll just bring that up, maybe bring it towards us a little. We'll go to that light. And we'd just like it to cast a shadow. So we'll go to the shadow and we'll go to a soft. Let's do a soft shadow. Now we've selected soft shadow. We're not seeing anything. And that's because by default, we don't have shadows activated in the viewport. So if you just go to options and select shadows in your OpenGL options, And now we're seeing those shadows. Now they're a little bit too dark, arguably. So let's just go back to our light. We can go to the shadow. Let's just reduce that density by 10%. There we go. Very nice. And that just makes it look visually a little bit more pleasing in the viewport. And there we go. Excellent. So we're pretty much there with both our rig for generating the dominoes, but what we need to do now, obviously, is make this dynamic so those dominoes interact with themselves and with each other. So that is what we'll get set up now. So let's just give ourselves a little bit of room here in our object manager, and we will just hit play. So what we want to do is create some dynamics here, and just to make this easier for us to view exactly what's going on, let's just reduce the amount of arrow particles, the amount of domino streams we've got. We'll just stick it down to 1. So let's go to our XP emitter arrow, go to the emission tab, and let's put the shot count from 10 back down to 1. And now we've just got 1 particle with a trail of these dominoes. So we want these dominoes to become dynamic. So obviously we need a bullet rigid body dynamic tag. So what we could do is we could go to our XP generator, which is creating that geometry. We can go to tags, INSYDIUM tags, bullet tags, and we can go xpBullet rigid body. So now these will have dynamics. And if we hit play, you're going to see that it's not going to really look what we're hoping for. They're all kind of falling over, and then we're getting this bouncing and jittering about. And the reason we have got that is a couple of things. The main reason is that all of our dynamics tags have bounce and friction settings, and the bullet tags have scatter settings as well. So if we just go, first of all, to our XP generator bullet tab, and then if we go to the simulation tab, dynamics tab, we've got bounce, friction, and scatter. So every time this is bouncing, it's been given this kind of a random angle of bounce, which is the scatter, and it's not what we want in this instance. So let's just take that off. Let's take the bounce off, and let's put there. We'll just put the friction way up. But we also need to do the same thing on our floor collider tag. So let's go into there. You can see we've got the same settings in this tag. So let's reduce the bounce, definitely reduce the scatter, put that friction way up. Now if we hit play, you're going to see that's made it better, but it's still going to be moving a bit, and it's not quite right. Well, that's because when we're using xpBullet on objects that are driven by particles, so whether that's on an emitter itself directly or on an XP generator or an XP sprite object, you need to remember that the parent particle has bounce and friction settings too. So let's go to our emitter spawn, which is creating the particles which are driving our dominoes. Let's go to the extended data tab, physical data, and look, we have bounce and friction settings. So let's put the bounce way down. Let's put the friction way up. And now you're going to see we're getting something that looks a lot better, but it's still not quite right. Our orientation isn't quite right, and we're getting a bit of movement. And the reason this is happening is because our emitter is creating, the spawn emitter is creating these particles, and they have no size at all. They have 0 radius, so they don't exist. And then they're being scaled up to 30 centimeters with our scale modifier. And Bullet has to create that collision geometry, and it's being told that the geometry has no size at all when it's born. So if we just force this and say they have to be born at, say, 4 centimeters, force a bit of size to them and hit play, you'll see that they're being born correctly. But it's still not quite what we want. So this is the trick. This is what we're going to do. And this is the beauty of xpBullet, is that we can create really easily controllable rigs that will remain procedural with our dynamics active as well. So this is what we're going to do. Let's just put that radius back down to 0 on our emitter. And what we will do is we will delete this bullet tag from our XP generator dominoes. And this is what we're going to do instead. We're going to have 2 generators. One is going to be dynamic and the other isn't going to be dynamic. And the way we'll do that is let's just hold Control or Command and drag our XP generator to make a copy. And the new one, we'll call it generator dynamic. All right. And on the new one, this is the one that we're going to put the tags. Let's go to tags, INSYDIUM tags, bullet tags, rigid body. And whilst we're here, let's just take that bounce and scatter off, put the friction up, and leave everything else default. So now what we have is our copied generator, the one that we've called dynamic. If we go to the object tab, it's still referencing that spawning emitter. So now basically we've got two generators creating creating dominoes on top of each other from the same particles, one of which is dynamics. This is not what we want. What we want to do is generate some first and then swap them and generate the dynamic ones at a particular point in our scene. And we're going to do that using particle groups. So let's set this up. We'll go to our emitter spawn, which creates the dominoes. Let's go to our groups tab. And at the moment, we're not using any groups. So let's hold Control or Command, and we can click the Create and Add Group. And we'll click that twice to make two groups. So now what's happening is when the emitter spawn creates its particles, the mode set to random. So they're randomly putting those particles in either group 1 or group 2. But we don't want that. We want them all to go into group 1. And then we want to choose when they are moved into group 2. And that's going to give us the control. So let's go to our mode. And instead of it being random, let's put first group only. So now they're all getting put into group 1. And at the moment, group 2 is doing nothing. There's no particles in group 2. They're all just been put into group 1 from this spawning emitter. So why have we done this? Well, here is the trick. In our first XP generator, the one that isn't dynamic, let's go on to that. Let's go on to the Groups Affected tab, and let's just drag in group 1. So if a particle's in group 1, it is not going to be making, it's going to be making a non-dynamic domino. And in the dynamic generator, Groups Affected, we'll put particle group 2. Okay, cool. So at the moment, because all the particles are being put in particle group 1, we have no dynamic dominoes at all. This generator is doing nothing because there are no particles in group 2. But if we can move particles from group 1 into group 2, suddenly the domino will go from being non-dynamic to being dynamic. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use a change group. Well, we could do this via a modifier or an action, and we can decide when and how it changes group. So we get loads of procedural control over this. So we're going to do this with let's do it with an emitter question. So we're going to go to our emitter spawn. Let's go to the questions tab. And we don't have any questions at the moment. We want to add a new question. So let's add a question. And we're seeing the attributes of our new question here. And that question, if we just have a look in the object manager, under the questions null in our system, we now have this default particle age question. And if we go back to our emitter spawn, in the questions tab, there's our particle age question. So let's have a look. What is this actually doing? What does it mean? Well, by default, it is a particle data age question, and it asks a question of the particles, and it's saying, if the particle is greater than 90 frames, and these are just the default values, if it's greater than 90 frames, then do something. And we haven't set it to do anything yet, but that's what it's saying. Now, we could use age, but instead, we know that we're scaling our particles up over time from 0 to 30 centimeters radius. So let's do that. Let's ask a question of the particle radius. So we'll click radius. And the mode, we could set to equals, that would work. So we could say, look, when the particle equals 30 centimeters in radius, then do something. And what do we want it to do? We want it to jump from group 1 into group 2, which will suddenly create dynamic dominoes. So that's what we need. We need an action which is going to make particles move groups. So let's go to add action. And we get this default action. The action is showed up here in our actions null, and by default it's just set to this editor display default action. But we can change that. So let's change the action type to a direct action. And the direct action, we've got all of these we can choose from. We want to change the group. It's going to change the particle groups. Let's click on that. Come down a little bit further. So it's a direct change, and it's going to change the group, and it's saying, what's the new group? Where do you want to put the particles? So let's drag in particle group 2. We want them to jump into group 2. And these are all the different parameters that they can inherit from the first one. We don't really need any of that, really. We'll just leave it. We'll get rid of that color. So now what is happening is when those particles get to 30 centimeters, they're being moved from group 1 into group 2. So suddenly our XP generator dynamic, which is using particle group 2, will create dynamic dominoes. Let's have a look. And we can see they're starting to wobble a bit. So now we have this dynamic setup. That is definitely working. Let's just knock some of these dominoes over so we definitely know that we're getting what we want here. So let's bring in a primitive sphere, and we'll just lift it up. Let's scale it down just a wee bit. Something like that. So at frame, when do we want this to knock over? Maybe start knocking it over at about that point. So at frame 92, let's go to our sphere. We'll go to the coordinates tab. We'll put a keyframe on the Y, go forward a couple of frames, move it down so it's intersecting that first domino, another keyframe, and then we can make that sphere invisible. Now, obviously, it's going to do nothing now because our sphere isn't dynamic. It's not going to knock them over. We can see its axis going down. So let's give it we need to give it a collider tag. So let's go to tags, INSYDIUM tags, bullet collider, and there we go. Let's just collapse that system. Click off that axis. Right, so let's hit play. Sphere knocks it over. And now we're getting our street. We have it. We've done it. We've got our dominoes working. Let's put a few more frames on our timeline. Actually, look, we'll put it way up just in case. 800 frames. Press play. And there are dominoes being knocked over. And it's working really nicely. And we're getting this nice scaling up of particles. And we just ensure that at this point, as they're scaling up and getting in position, they're not dynamic. And then they're going to be perfectly dynamic. And we can control when that happens. And the beauty, as I said earlier, is that it's entirely procedural, this rig. The only thing we've keyframed is our collider sphere. So we have ultimate adjustability and kind of artistic control over this. So let's make our scene a little bit more interesting now. We've got our one trail of dominoes, which is working nicely. So let's reintroduce some more particles. So we'll go to our system. Let's go to our emitter arrow, and we will change that shot count from 1 to, say, I don't know, let's go with maybe 13. Hit play. And what do we get? So we get lots of particles. Looking pretty cool. They're all kind of intersecting, so they've started that motion themselves, but then our sphere comes along to make sure that we get any stragglers. I think arguably that sphere creating this motion is happening a little bit too late. Remember, if we just make that visible and we highlight the sphere, you can see we have keyframed its Y position here just before kind of frame 100. It's a bit late, I think. So let's just run that through. We could probably do with it coming down at, I'd say there, that point there, really. So let's make a selection, a little mini timeline here. You see they've gone gold. That means we can then move them back. Now that sphere is going to come down at that point, which is a bit earlier, which knocks over any straggling dominoes, and they go. Let's just view that. Make sure everything has been hit by the sphere. Yeah, and everything's been knocked over now. And that's looking really nice. So this is similar to the simulation that we had in our reference video, and one of the properties of that was that we had the dominoes knocking each other over as they developed their trails, but there was also a bit of kind of self-spawning knock as these dynamic dominoes are born, they knock each other over, which gives this nice rippling effect. Now that in our reference looked really good, and it's a really nice part of it, but we may actually want to avoid that and have a slightly different look. So let's give our particles a bit of colour first, and then we'll look at how we might do this differently so we have kind of individual trails of dominoes that aren't having this kind of self-spawning intersection at this area. So let's do that colour. We'll go to our modifiers menu. Let's go to control modifiers, and we want to control the colour. We'll click that. Let's just drag this up a bit. We'll go to the object tab, and the colour operation, we don't want to set immediate, which is making them white. If we hit play, you'll see they've all gone white. Let's go and change that from set color immediate to, let's do gradient by parameter. And we've got a default gradient here, and it is being set to map over the particle age. So that when the dominoes are born, they'll be this blue and they'll gradually turn white. Let's just get rid of that garish blue. Right click, and we'll distribute the knots to redistribute that gradient. And we've got a really long viewport timeline here, 800 frames. So they're only going to be turning white when they get, look here, it's 600 frames. So let's just reduce this down a bit to say 200. That'll probably be enough. Let's have a look. Double check. So they begin the blue color, and as they get older, they lighten, which is a nice effect. We could even move that knot up a bit, I think. Very nice. That's looking very cool. Okay, so let's just sort out, before we have a look at a slightly different look, let's just sort out a very, very basic scene camera here. So what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of position our viewport camera with our axis kind of near the middle, and we want it to be, I would say, something like that. All right, so let's create a scene camera. Now we're going to create a null object, which of course will be created right in the middle of our scene. And all we're going to do is, look, let's make our camera a child of the null. Let's look through the camera by clicking the white square. And now if we go to our null, to the coordinates, and we adjust the rotational values on the heading, now we're going to be rotating perfectly around that center axis. So let's just do a really simple camera move. So we'll go back to frame 0. We'll hit a keyframe on the heading of our null. Let's let this animation run through a little bit. And let's keep going. Somewhere about there is fine. Okay, so we'll stop it there. Let's animate around that heading a little bit. Another keyframe, and now we've got a really, really simple camera move as those dominoes progress. Very nice. So let's do a slightly different simulation now, one in which we get kind of much more separated dominoes and we don't get as much of this immediate intersecting. So the way in which we are going to do that is we're just going to change the emitter emission shape. So let's go to our arrow emitter. We'll go to the display tab so we can have a look at the outline of that emitter again. Draw emitter we deactivated. So let's reactivate that so we can see this circular emission. Now our particles are emitting from anywhere within that surface area of that circle. So one way of changing it would just be to go to our emission tab, our object tab of our emitter, and just click ring only, and now they'll only emit from this outer ring. And now you're going to get a much more kind of uniform look, but they're still kind of being born. They're being born kind of randomly along this ring. So we've got lots being born here and a couple being born here. So we can make this much more even, like perfectly evenly distributed, by changing this from an emitter shaped circle to a defined emission. So let's click that, and now we have got these squares which will emit one particle each. We'll change it from inline to a circular emission. And you can see this isn't orientated correctly. Look, there's that circular emission there. So what we need to do is just hit R for the rotation tool, and then move that. If you hit Shift, it'll jump in 5-degree increments, so we need to put that up to 90 degrees. Let's go back to our emitter arrow. Let's hit radial, which means that they'll shoot out correctly. Now if we hit play, now we have got 5 perfectly formed domino trails. And if we want more particles, we just increase the count on our defined emission. And that's looking really cool. So just one thing to note here, remember that we are using a hidden sphere to knock over our dominoes. If we make that visible, the sphere is a smaller radius now than our defined emission radius. So let's just make this defined emission radius smaller. Let's put it at, say, 65. Hit play. Now, is that going to be small enough for our sphere to knock them over? Oh, it just hits 1, so not quite. So we could make that, let's make it 55. Now, of course, you could look at the precise dimensions of the sphere and get it perfect, but let's just eyeball it. Here we go. Knocks them over, and there goes our trail of dominoes. So the procedural nature of this rig means that we can make changes whenever we want. You can use it in one particular configuration for one job, and then if you needed another job that was using a similar type of dynamic interaction, you could just make those adjustments from your base rig, and it's going to work perfectly well for you. So that is the basics of setting up this nice procedural domino rig and then making that dynamic using xpBullet rigid bodies.